The man behind the table didn't even look up when Celeste walked in. That's the part that stays with you. Not the words that came later, and there were words, plenty of them, but that first moment of deliberate invisibility. The way a person can make you feel like you don't exist simply by refusing to acknowledge that you do. Celeste Ibarra had driven 40 minutes in a rental car through a city she didn't know, following directions to a community arts center that turned out to be wedged between a dry cleaner and a check-cashing place on a street that Google Maps still had listed as under construction. She was 53 years old. She had spent the last 22 years as a choral director at a university in Atlanta. She had 3 albums, 2 Grammy nominations, not wins, but nominations, which she had long ago made peace with, and a voice that her students described, when they thought she wasn't listening, as the kind of thing that made you feel like someone had reached inside your chest and rearranged something. None of that was visible when she walked into the audition room. What was visible? A woman in her 50s, dark-skinned, wearing a plain gray cardigan over a white shirt, carrying a tote bag with a broken strap that she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. She had on reading glasses she'd forgotten to take off. Her hair was natural and pulled back simply, the way she wore it when she wasn't performing, when she was just herself moving through the world. The man behind the table, his name was Harwick. She would learn later, first name Dougal, though everyone called him by his last name like it was a title. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen in his hand, and he was writing something, or pretending to write something, and he did not look up. The woman next to him, a younger woman with reading glasses perched on her own nose, glanced at Celeste and smiled briefly. Apologetically, almost, the kind of smile that already knows what's about to happen. The third person at the table, a heavy-set man in his 60s named Terrell Boone, looked up immediately. He had kind eyes. She would remember that later, too. Celeste stood at the back of the room for a moment. There was a mark on the floor, a piece of blue painter's tape that indicated where the performers were supposed to stand. She walked to it. She stood on it. She waited. Harwick finished writing whatever he was writing. He set down his pen. He looked up. He looked at her the way you look at something that shouldn't be there. "This is the advanced vocal division," he said. "Did you mean to register for the community choir?" She had been prepared for a lot of things. She had been warned, actually. A colleague of hers, a tenor named Frederick, who had competed in this festival the previous year, had told her over the phone, "Harwick is difficult. Harwick is the kind of man who decided 30 years ago what talent looks like and has not updated that picture since." Frederick had laughed when he said it, the way people laugh at things that are genuinely not funny. She had laughed too, because what else do you do? But standing in that room, on that piece of blue tape, with Harwick looking at her like she was a scheduling error, she felt something move through her that she hadn't felt in years. Something old, something she thought she'd outgrown. She hadn't outgrown it. Nobody does. They just get better at carrying it. "I registered for the advanced division," she said. Her voice was even. She'd had 22 years of practice keeping her voice, even when the rest of her was anything but. Harwick looked down at his legal pad. "Name?" "Celeste Ibarra." He found something on the pad. "Read it." Looked back up at her with an expression that could only be described as disappointed. "It says here you're from Atlanta." "That's right. This is a regional festival, Mid-Atlantic region. I know. I'm here as a guest entrant. The application allows for it. I spoke with your coordinator, Yvonne." She paused. She didn't remember Yvonne's last name. 3 weeks ago, she confirmed my eligibility." Harwick looked at the younger woman beside him. The younger woman, whose name Celeste still didn't know, nodded slightly. "She's on the list, Dougal." "Everything's in order." Harwick didn't respond to that. He picked up his pen again and made a small mark on the legal pad that could have meant anything. "What are you performing?" "Ich habe genug," she said. "Back. BWV 82, originally written for bass voice. I'll be performing the soprano transposition." Something shifted in Harwick's face. Not softening, exactly, more like recalibration. He hadn't expected that. Bach cantata, German, Baroque form, technically demanding. Not what he'd been expecting from whatever he'd already decided she was. But he recovered quickly. "That's a challenging piece for this format," he said, in the tone of a man explaining something to someone who doesn't quite understand. "The festival runs on a tight schedule. If you're not prepared—" "I'm prepared," she said. She said it simply. No edge, no performance of confidence, no need to convince anyone of anything. She was 53 years old. She had been prepared. Harwick leaned back in his chair. He glanced at Terrell Boone, who was looking at Celeste with that same steady attention, and then he looked back at his legal pad as if it were the most interesting thing in the room. "Go ahead," he said. It was not an invitation. It was a dismissal that happened to be pointing in the right direction. She didn't have an accompanist. She'd asked about the festival's house pianist when she registered, and had been told one would be provided. But when she arrived that morning, she'd been informed by a harried young man in a headset who clearly had 17 other problems to solve, that the house pianist had called in sick, and they were running the day a cappella or with backing tracks, her choice. She'd chosen a cappella. She always had. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, not for effect. She did this before every performance, had done it since she was 19 years old, and her voice teacher, a tiny, fierce woman from New Orleans who'd passed away a decade ago, had told her, "Those 3 seconds are yours. That's when you decide who you are before you open your mouth." Then she opened her mouth. The thing about Ik Habajanug, and Terrell Boone would say this afterward, would repeat it several times in the days that followed because he couldn't seem to stop. The thing about it is that it translates to it is enough. The entire piece is an expression of contentment at the edge of something vast. Bach wrote it for a man at peace with dying. The paradox of singing it with a living human voice, with breath and vibration and all the insistence of being alive, is that it becomes something else entirely. It becomes an argument, a claim. I am here, and I am sufficient, and whatever you were planning to think about me, it is enough. Celeste Ibarra knew what she was singing. She had chosen it deliberately. By the second phrase, Terrell Boone had put down his pen. By the end of the first section, the younger woman, her name was Caroline Fisk. She would introduce herself afterward with tears she was clearly embarrassed about, had her hand over her mouth. Harwick sat very still. There's a particular quality to a great voice in an acoustically ordinary room, a community arts center between a dry cleaner and a check cashing place, that you don't get in a concert hall. In a concert hall, there's architecture to help, surfaces designed to amplify and flatter and distribute. In a plain room with drop ceilings and fluorescent lights and painted cinder block, a voice either fills the space or it doesn't. There's no help coming. Celeste filled the room. She filled it the way warm air fills a space, not by forcing itself in, but by simply being, until the absence of it would be what you noticed. She sang the second movement slower than most performers do. She'd made that choice years ago and stood by it. The mourning in it, because there is mourning in it even alongside the piece, deserved space. She gave it space. When she finished, the sound didn't stop immediately. It ended, and then there was a moment where the room held it, the way a hand holds water before it's gone. Terrell Boone stood up. He wasn't supposed to. The festival protocol didn't include standing ovations during auditions. It was an audition, not a recital, and there were forms to be filled out and scores to be tabulated. But he stood up. He stood up the way people do things they don't decide to do. The way the body gets ahead of the brain, and the brain eventually catches up and doesn't disagree. Caroline Fisk stood up beside him a moment later. Harwick remained seated. He was looking at his legal pad. He had picked up his pen again. His hand was not moving, but he was looking at the pad as though it might tell him something useful. Celeste stood on the blue tape and waited. She was good at waiting. She'd had a lot of practice. What happened next is the part that matters, though it didn't happen in that room. It happened 2 days later, at the formal competition, in front of 340 people in the festival's main hall, a genuine concert venue, with good acoustics and proper lighting, and a program that had been printed and distributed, and that listed Celeste Ibarra, guest entrant from Atlanta, performing Ich habe Genug by Johann Sebastian Bach. Harwick was not on the judges' panel for the final competition. He'd been on the selection panel for the auditions, which was where his authority ended. The final judges were three people brought in from outside: a professor from the Curtis Institute, a music critic from Philadelphia, and a conductor named Giselle Ophobi, who had spent 30 years with orchestras in Brussels and London and had returned to the States 2 years ago to lead a regional symphony. Giselle Ophobi, who was 61 years old and had heard approximately everything, and was not easily surprised. Harwick was in the audience. He had no official reason to be at the finals at all, and yet there he was, 3 rows from the back, with his legal pad on his knee. Celeste did not know he was there. She was backstage, doing the 3-second thing, the thing her voice teacher had taught her, deciding who she was before she opened her mouth. There were 11 other performers in the advanced vocal division. A 24-year-old tenor from Baltimore who'd been performing professionally for 3 years and had a following on social media, which was the kind of thing that mattered now. A mezzo-soprano from D.C. who had trained in Vienna and had the posture to prove it. Several others who were talented, genuinely talented, in the way that a room full of people who have dedicated their lives to a thing tends to be full of talent, which is to say, the difficulty is not finding the talent. The difficulty is the other thing, the ineffable thing, the thing that happens when the room holds the sound. When Celeste walked onto the stage, she heard something in the audience, a murmur, the kind that isn't quite a whisper but isn't a full sound, more like a collective inhale, a collective adjustment of expectation. She was older than every other performer. She was dressed plainly, the gray cardigan again, though she'd replaced the tote bag. She wore small gold earrings, the ones she'd bought herself on her 50th birthday, and her reading glasses were in her pocket this time. She walked to the center of the stage. She found the spot. She stood in it the way a person stands in a place they're supposed to be. The accompanist, a young man who'd been briefed and was ready, played the brief introduction. She heard it. She waited for her moment. Then she sang. She would tell her students afterward. She would tell this story many times, though she would leave certain parts out. Would leave out Harwick in the audition room and the look on his face and the way he'd said, "This is the advanced vocal division." She would tell them that she'd felt something different about this performance. Not better. She'd performed Ich habe genug in better venues. But different. There was something specific about singing it in that room, in that city, in front of 340 people who had not expected her, and she sang it for all of them. She sang it especially for the people who hadn't expected her, because that's what the piece is about. That's what it has always been about. I have everything I need. I arrived here with everything I need. Whatever you thought when you saw me, it is enough. The woman in the second row started crying at the same point Caro had cried 2 days before. Different woman, same measure. There's a phrase in the second section that does it. She'd observed this phenomenon for years and still didn't have a sufficient explanation for it. Giselle Ophobi leaned forward in her chair. The Curtis professor, a man who had the professional reputation of a glacier, slow-moving and difficult to melt, removed his glasses. When Celeste finished, the hall was quiet for the full count of 3. She counted to herself. She always counted. Then the applause started, and it was the kind of applause that begins in a specific section and then travels, like a wave, like something catching. It moves from the front, and then outward, and then back. And somewhere in the back 3 rows, a man with a legal pad on his knee found that he had put the legal pad on the floor, and his hands were doing what hands do when they can't not. Giselle Ophobi stood up. She didn't say anything, not yet. That would come later, during the judge's remarks, when she would speak in a careful, measured voice about craft and training and intentionality, and then stop mid-sentence and say, "You know, I'm going to dispense with the formal language. I have been sitting in this chair for 31 years, and I have heard what I heard today 4, maybe 5 times. That's the honest count. 4 or 5 times in 31 years. She would look at Celeste when she said it. Celeste would look back at her without looking away. But that was later. First, Giselle Ophobi stood up, and then the Curtis professor stood up, and then the third judge, and then, rippling back through the rows, 340 people in an auditorium in a mid-Atlantic city. stood up for a 53-year-old woman in a gray cardigan who had driven here in a rental car and hadn't been expected and had brought everything she needed already. There is a specific kind of moment, and if you've ever been in a room when it happens, you know exactly what this is, when something true gets proven in public. Not argued, not debated, proven. The way gravity is proven not by discussion, but by letting go of something. That was the moment. Celeste stood in it. She let it happen. She was good at that, too, had learned over years that receiving a thing fully was its own kind of skill, that the temptation to deflect or minimize was real and worth resisting. She thanked the judges. She thanked the accompanist. She walked off the stage. In the wings, she stopped. She stood very still. She thought about her voice teacher, the tiny, fierce woman from New Orleans, who had told her 34 years ago, "One day you are going to be in a room and you are going to sing, and the room is going to understand you. That is what we are working toward. Not perfection, not awards. Understanding." She'd been working toward it for 34 years. It turned out the room was a community arts center in a city she didn't know, between a dry cleaner and a check-cashing place. The room was a concert hall with 340 people who hadn't expected her. The room was two separate places, and both of them had understood. She took out her phone. She called her daughter in Atlanta, who picked up on the second ring, and when her daughter said, "Mom, how'd it go?" Celeste laughed. Not the performance laugh, not the professional laugh, the real one, the one that starts somewhere below the sternum, and said, "I'll tell you everything. It's going to take a while." What happened to Harwick, specifically, is a matter of public record, since the festival board made its decision in a formal meeting that produced formal minutes. The audition recording, the festival recorded all auditions for internal review purposes, had been reviewed. The specific portion reviewed was the segment in which Harwick asked Celeste if she had meant to register for the community choir. 3 board members watched it, then 2 more. Then the board chair, a retired music teacher from suburban Maryland named Elliot Gunderson, who had been running this festival for 16 years, and who, when he watched the recording, sat very quietly for a moment and then said to no one in particular, "Dougal's been on this panel since the beginning." That's the whole problem, isn't it? Harwick was asked to step down from the audition panel. He was not asked to leave the organization entirely. The board was careful about that, made no accusations, cited only the need for the panel to better reflect the festival's stated values of inclusion and artistic rigor. But his role was formally reduced, and his name was removed from the following year's materials. He did not contest it. He was a man who understood, when things shifted, that they had shifted. He had that much self-awareness, whether he understood why they had shifted, whether he sat somewhere that evening and replayed the moment, the plain gray cardigan, and the broken tote bag, and the reading glasses, and the woman standing on the blue tape, and heard what he had been too certain of his own certainties to hear in the room. No one knows. That part is private. That part belongs to him. What belongs to everyone else is what happened in the hall, the standing, the wave of it. Giselle Ophobe's honest count, 4, maybe 5 times in 31 years. And Celeste Ibarra, 53, standing in the wings on a Tuesday afternoon, calling her daughter, laughing the real laugh. She won the division. She donated the prize money to a scholarship fund she'd established for music students at her university who couldn't afford instruments. She mentioned the festival in an interview she gave the following spring, mentioned it briefly, warmly, without naming anyone, and said that it had reminded her of something she'd known for a long time but occasionally needed to be reminded of, that a room full of people, any room, any people, will recognize the truth when it arrives. They can't help it. It's the one thing that can't be argued with. "They judged me before I opened my mouth," she said in the interview. The interviewer leaned forward. Celeste smiled, and then I opened my mouth. That was all she said about it. It was enough.